Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to get myself organized here. So, really, we were typing up fancy objectives, and it was so hard for us to do that. And then when we started just talking conversationally, what is our goal for this? This is what we came up with. And then I realized, we don't always have to have our fancy pants on. We can just talk to people, right? So what our goal is today is really to think about. Of course, everyone knows about routines, procedures, and expectations, but how we can leverage those to make students more successful, and that we can pre-plan, and then we can add in some supports, create some structures to make our lives easier and to make their lives easier and to build independence on their part. So if we have these wonderful things in place and they're appropriately supported, it's a lot of work on the front end, but it works out for everyone in the end. That's really our goal for today.
All right. Would you like for me to go through the agenda or?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. All right. So today the plan is to talk about structuring our classroom for success, talking about expectations um, versus rules, procedures and routines, and then how we leverage structure during our transitions. And then we absolutely plan to build in some reflection and some work time. Okay. All right. So, if you could take a look at this statement here, it says a good teacher has few rules but many procedures. So, if you could take about 30 seconds or so and just kind of think about that statement. I think instead of us dropping into the chat, if we could unmute ourselves, if you would like to share how that statement resonates with you, what does that mean to you? A good teacher has few rules, but many procedures.
I really like this because I like to think of it in my classroom as expectations. Like we give them an expectation to rise to versus rules, which can have such a negative connotation. And so, along those lines, having those procedures that the kids learn and can be fluent with, um, then they know what they're supposed to do, so you don't have to lay it out in terms of rules,
Mhm.
I guess.
I would agree with that. I only have like three umbrella rules in my room, but they go over all the procedures too. So it's always something you can tie back to that, like tie right back to, hey, if you're talking in the hallway, is it being respectful to other people? Things like that that are you can tie back with the procedures.
Mm, absolutely. Would anyone else like to add anything to this or?
I have the older students, and so I always think protocols, like for conversations. We teach adults the protocols and so forth, but sometimes we forget. The kids need the same perimeters, but we don't. I don't really think about them as rules so much. Just conversational expectations, I guess.
Mhm.
I'm going to chime in, Erica. Yeah, I really like that. I wrote down the word protocols and to kind of build what Alyssa and Emily said. Rules do kind of have a hierarchy built in them, right? Like if we make the rules, then we're the enforcer of the rules. And not that it's bad that we're in charge of a classroom, but I think some students can be challenged by that authority that is associated with rules sometimes.
Mhm.
But procedures don't sting as much.
All right. Are we ready to move on or? Okay. All right. So I'd like for you to take a look at the screen. When we talk about our procedures. And so, something we'd like for you to do is think about a time when you experience one of these things here. You either walked into a doctor's office, a restaurant, a store, a classroom, sporting event, party, whatever the event was, and it was messy and chaotic. Think about your experience in that place and at that event. And were you able to accomplish anything? And just while you're thinking about that, I just want to make the connection between the chaos and things being disorderly, and you being able to connect that to classroom experiences that maybe your students have had. So think about those things. And then if anyone would like to unmute and share a situation that you've experienced where you like, maybe you could function in that environment, maybe you could not. What was your experience like?
I'll share. Sometimes this can be like my house or my kitchen or my own workspace at work. Not that, and when my workspace at work gets messy often, but when it does, I have to I'm not as I don't get as much done. So I'm sensitive to that with in my own area. So that's kind of what I was thinking about with the student when I was relating it to the students, like maybe their desk area, because like there's a lot we can't control around us. But at the same time, if my own space, if I let that get really messy, it does affect me, I think, is what I'm saying. So I was thinking about that with the kids, like maybe their desk area and their materials and things.
Mhm.
Last week, I was, sorry.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. Thank you.
I was at the Dollar Tree in Speedway, and it was ridiculous. Like half the shelves were missing stuff and everything all over the floor. And it made me like not even want to shop and not even want to go down some of those aisles because it was just overwhelming. And I think that's how I feel like right now. My closet at school is overwhelming because I moved rooms and everything just had to get put in the closet of my new room. And I like things organized, but when things are messy and having to get it organized, it's like I know how my kids feel because it overloads my brain a little bit. And I struggle with some of those what's the word I'm looking for? Processes that, help you.
Executive function.
Executive functioning. Thank you, Jamie. It's still early. So when things are too messy and you don't know how to use those executive functioning processes, it can just be overwhelming and you kind of want to shut down.
It's funny, Alyssa, that you brought up the Dollar Tree, because that's one of the places that I hear so many people complain about, that either they go in one and it's really well organized or it's a whole mess. And they're like, I'm not going back in that one. But I just think of two situations very quickly of my own. Same, I went into a store, Nordstrom Rack, and I went to a clearance section. There was no rhyme or reason to the organization. Things were everywhere. And I was excited to go, and I drove quite a distance. And then I spent minimal amount of time in the store because I just couldn't handle it. I couldn't figure out where things were. I didn't want to spend that time trying to gather my bearings. So I just left. And then I think even the same at home. I have kids at home, and especially during the summertime, they're eating throughout the whole day and they leave the kitchen a mess. And then they're like, hey, Mom, what's for dinner? And when I go and see this huge mess in my kitchen, I'm like, I can't, and I'm not going to cook right now until you all come in here and get it together. I can't find anything. It's a mess. And I'm not even going to try to begin the process until we get some organization going here. And so I think that, if we were to connect that to, just our rules and our routines and our transitions, I think that it definitely helps lower anxiety, and it levels the playing field for everyone and improves equity. And so, and some of us may not even think about it in that way, but for those children who may not be able to successfully function in your classroom without those pieces in place, think about how much of a disadvantage they're in, when they can't even get out the gate.
Sorry, I'm on a different device right now, and the buttons click differently. So Erica talked a little bit about how having clear routines, procedures, expectations impact us and our students. But really, at the end of the day, students want procedures and routines and clarity and expectations. They want to know how to please you. They want to know what the recipe is for success. Erica mentioned anxiety, and that's kind of the lens that I see these things through. I have walked in the classroom, so I have the benefit of going into lots of classrooms and not really knowing the classroom culture or the routines and the expectations and even like the teacher's personalities sometimes. And it's very eye-opening if I walk in and I'm working with a student and I don't know, are we allowed to get up and get another pencil if your pencil lead breaks? Or what do you do if you have to go to the restroom? Like what are the expectations here? And I'm an adult, and if I can't figure it out, I know that some of our students can't, especially the students, I guess, that I'm there to see who are struggling in that environment anyway. So I think that if you think about it through the lens of anxiety, it becomes pretty clear why it's so important. My example for the previous slide was thinking about an experience I had at Great Wolf Lodge, actually. Went with my sister and my kids and her kids, and you had to have specific color tubes to go down specific slides, and the lines for the slides started different places. And I just got so frustrated because we would get in one line with one tube and they'd be like, oh, you have to have this tube for that one and this tube. I was like, why don't you have any signs? Like, why didn't it say that at the beginning when I walked in? Or why didn't you lay that out? And, at various checkpoints throughout. And it became stressful until I could hold that information in my head and figure out all the rules of each one of the slides. And so it diminished our fun for a minute. We definitely got over it. But I think if you are able to do this and do this well, then we know that you have thought it through and that you've taken the time to really teach, do what's needed to support these things with your students so that every student can be successful. The other thing I wanted to mention is when you have routines and procedures for your students, for yourself, you don't get decision fatigue. It's already up there. You've already decided how you're managing your classroom and what you're going to do. So you don't have to come up with it on the spot. Where do you want them to turn in the work? Oh, can they go to the restroom or can they not? It's clear for you and it's clear for the students. So it takes work out of it in the moment. I did also read once that teachers make more decisions per day than a doctor. And I believe that because you're asked questions all day, every day. And some of them are informational, some of them are for permission. So anything that we can automate, we should. So I want to make sure that we are speaking a common language when we're talking about routines, expectations, procedures, and really procedures and routines. I had to think about this quite a bit and read a lot of examples because we use those words kind of interchangeably. But procedures are the process that things are done. It's the pattern, it's the step by step. So if you're in special education, sometimes we call that a task analysis when we're teaching steps of a process to students. So the procedures would be the steps of how you want them to accomplish something. So the procedure for lining up is first you will wait to be called, then you'll push in your chair, quietly walk to the door, stand on your dot and wait. Just those steps of what your expectations are. The routines are kind of the habits that are built from those procedures. I think as much as we tried, we probably use those interchangeably throughout this presentation. And then when we talk about expectations, those change throughout the day, throughout the activity. we have different expectations for students at lunch than we do during our direct teaching of math, right? We have different expectations depending on what we're doing. So if we can pre-plan for those and communicate those to our students as explicitly as possible and cover things that we don't think that we should need to. Are you allowed to talk? Are you allowed to get up and move around? How are you supposed to get help from the teacher or finish the assignment, or what should you do while you're waiting? If we can just pre-plan those and put those on the front end, then we don't, again, have to panic on the back end when we realize, oh, 5 students are done with this, but the other 20 are still working. We should just assume that that's going to happen. We can communicate it at the beginning, and then they'll know, and they don't have to interrupt you if they finish early or if they have a need. There's a system, so it promotes that independence too. I really like the phrase there that we can't assume that everyone can read the room or read the expectations. I know that's when you walk into an unfamiliar environment, that's the first thing we do, right? We're scanning, like, okay, are people talking? Are they not talking? Are they, pretty buttoned up and sitting quietly, or is it a more casual environment? Students are learning those skills. Even secondary students sometimes have struggled reading those social cues. And sometimes we just don't know what the expectations are. So if we can make those explicit, it's always going to be a win for our students. So if procedures establish a foundation for an effective classroom, so we've planned it out, everything's systematic, everyone knows what to expect, how do our expectations help promote an equitable environment? And I would just like to know what your guys' thoughts on this. I clearly have some, but would like to know where you guys are coming from with that.
I think the first thing that pops into my head is I ask mom and I ask dad, and I'll get a different answer. So as a teacher, you don't want your students to think that if Johnny asks, he'll get one answer, and if I ask, I'll get another answer. I think if the expectations are there for everybody, it alleviates some of the uncertainty in competition, maybe.
Yeah, I like that too. Yes.
I think of the saying that one of my best friends teaches in the life skills room, and she told me one time that a gen ed kid was saying, "Oh, that's not fair, that's not fair," and she said, "Well, fair means everyone gets what they need," and there's a difference between expectations and making sure all needs are met. And I think there's a lot of times where kids may have to have a little extra, something extra in order to be successful. And I think explaining to them that it's not fair isn't everyone gets the same, fair is everyone gets what they need.
Yeah, that's perfect too. Anyone else have a thought about that? I think when I was thinking about objectivity, and that kind of goes along with what you guys were saying. But there's no judgment on if I have to redirect a student if I have been clear with the expectations. Everyone has the equal opportunity and access to meet those expectations. Um, and students may not have to ask questions, because then if you have to ask questions to clarify, then you're leaving out students who may be too shy or can't formulate the question or can't get your attention. So that's not equitable. So if you're clear and you point it out at the very beginning, and it's a process and a routine, procedure, expectation that you have taught in practice, then everyone has access to it. And if they're not meeting the expectation, that's just objective observation, and we can provide support however we need to. I was thinking about ways that these expectations cannot be equitable. And one of the things would be access. So, do we communicate it in a way that's accessible for all students in language that all students understand? So, even if I say we're going to be respectful, do we all agree on what respect means and what respect sounds like? Is talking back, how is that perceived, right? Like, are students allowed to talk in the classroom without raising their hand? Generally not, right? But what if it's on task and in the middle of a lesson and they're super engaged? Do we bend the rules for that? I always feel compelled to, because you like don't want to put out that fire that they're excited about, but at the same time that wasn't the expectation. So there's a lot of like trickiness there, so we want to be clear and make sure that we're using that common language and that the students have had a voice in voicing what that means. So if we say we're going to be respectful, that's our expectation, the students help come up with what is respectful, what does that sound like, what does that look like in these different environments. The last thing I wanted to mention was about students who are consistently not able to meet your expectations. So then, is that an equitable environment? If you have clear expectations for everyone, but then you have 3 students who consistently can't do it, I think the traditional lens is to think those students are the problem, right? Well, 97% of the class can meet it. But from where I come from, I'm like, how can we just build them up, kind of what you were saying, Emily, and provide them what support they need in order to be able to meet the expectations? That way they have equitable access to the same that the other students are getting. So we'll talk about that, maybe some ways to do that. But does anyone have any further thoughts about that?
This year I had a class that was so big personalities and very loud. And last year it was, if they were working, I could hear a pencil drop. This year they talked to themselves, and it took me about until like Halloween time to figure that out, because I was getting so frustrated. I was like, no, we're not talking while we're working. But then I would look around, they're not talking to each other. And I'm realizing that they're just kind of talking to themselves as they're working. And I have ENL kids. So I was like, this is not a battle I should be fighting. So that was something that I had to adjust.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. I think if we can take a step back and be objective, we can figure it out. But when things get rolling and we're super busy and stressed and trying to meet our agendas, sometimes it does feel like it's their problem, not ours. But there are always things that we can do to be helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yep, you're good.
All right. I just want to make sure that anyone else who wanted an opportunity to speak could do so. All right. So we are going to transition right now, and we are going to start thinking about our own learning spaces and do a little bit of work. So I want you to think about routines that you have in place right now for your students in your learning space. We recognize that not everyone in here is just in the classroom. So just think about your learning space altogether. What routines do you have in place? What routines or procedures do you establish the first week of classes? So if someone is working in your group or if they are in your classroom, out the gate, we want to establish those routines and those procedures that kind of set the pace and set the tone for the year. And I know that there are opportunities to tweak as we go. But what are those routines and procedures? And what routines do you currently have in place for yourself in your learning space? So what we're going to do is a self-assessment, and I am going to, before I say anything else, I'm going to drop that in the chat right now. When I drop this link in there, you will need to make a copy for yourself, and I'll explain to you what you'll do with that. Okay. So there you go. And it should be viewable. Definitely change the settings. So let me know if there are any issues. But with the self-assessment, and let me see if I can't toggle so that you can see it from my screen here. Nope, let's do this.
While Erica's doing that and you're getting that open, you'll see like there are a ton of items listed on some of those tabs, and you don't have to panic. They may not all apply to your environment. So, but they do kind of outline some areas that you may not have thought about adding procedures or clarifying your expectations. And then the horizontal questions across the top might be some cues or prompts of things that you haven't thought about before.
Okay. So if you take a look at this, there are 4 tabs across the bottom. So the first one is routines for your students. So we have a column going down the side that's even considering the entering the room, putting items in cubbies, and just working through all of those things. Half of this is first thing in the morning, but getting in line, restroom breaks, transitions, all of those. So you may want to jot down in this column here where it says, what do students look like and sound like during this time? If you want to just jot down a couple of items, it doesn't need to be, a paragraph or super thorough. But then the rest of the way where it says, is it enforced consistently? Do students appear to know it? Is it visually supported? And is it regularly referred to? You can just put a check mark or an X there. If you can say yes, entering the room is that procedure is enforced consistently. If you can say yes, students appear to know that procedure, then you can click there. And so it just kind of gives you an idea of maybe some procedures or transitions or routines in your classroom where you're like, okay, you know what, I can strengthen in those areas, or we can strengthen that up a little bit because it wasn't consistent, or we kind of fell apart during this time, or we had to make changes to it constantly. So those are routines for students. And then if there's anyone who works virtually, then there's a tab for that. And then if you're at the secondary level, there's a tab for you. And then lastly, routines for self. So we want you to think about routines for yourself. So really, you'll only be looking at 2 tabs. So for your students, if you're elementary, virtual, or secondary, so you'll be doing one of those 3, and then the routines for yourself. And Jamie, I think we were thinking roughly just 3 to 5 minutes or so, just to kind of go through that self-assessment. And then we'll talk just a little bit about it when we come back together. What you can do, I think everyone has already done that. You can go ahead and turn your cameras off. And then if you feel like you're at a good stopping place, you can come back so that we'll let you know. So we'll know that you're ready to discuss.
everyone wants to take a second and kind of finish up what you're looking at and rejoin the group. Thank you, Alyssa.
All right. So with this, and you look at your self-assessment. Oh, okay. I'm looking at Emily's comment. Sorry, that kind of caught me. Good deal. Thanks. I'm glad you enjoyed actually filling that out, and something to think about. Absolutely something to consider. So you said like the new year, new teachers, first year teachers, and something amazing to have prior to year one. We definitely will get that out, and we could even share it with our building leaders and ask them, to get that out. And then I know many schools have, new teacher cadres or academies, so that's something that we could, think about sharing that out to them as well, so that they can share it to the group. So thanks. All right. Are there any parts that anyone would like to discuss, either when you think about routines that you have in place for yourself in your learning space, or those routines in your classroom, any areas where you thought, oh, okay, these are strengths, and it was noticeable by filling this out, or there are weaknesses, I wasn't able to put any X's in across the board at all, or maybe just one, and I need to just kind of tighten the reins a little bit, or, do better because this was definitely a trouble spot for me. Okay, I see that it's a great resource for going back and forth between virtual and brick and mortar. Absolutely, because things look very different when you go back and forth between the two. So.
I just want to say, in general, setting up these routines and procedures was something I struggled with last year. And I worked with fifth grade, and I don't know why, but for some reason it was like, oh, by fifth grade, like, they should know some of these general things. But especially working at a school like Sanders, they don't, or at least, things don't always stick. And so, since I didn't kind of establish that right away, by the time I tried to implement more stuff, it was kind of like they'd already been doing different things, and it just made things a mess, as Jamie can, um, agree with me on there. We did work together. Um, so that is definitely something I want to work on this year. And so I agree having that list, because I was already getting ready to start setting up a list of routines to establish. So having this document, I think will be really helpful, and just um, having our champs posted in the classroom and referred to a lot, I think will definitely help. But just in general, establishing these routines, I think, is definitely something I need to work on.
Great. Thanks. And you know what? And the self-assessment absolutely served its purpose then, when you see, that there are things that you need to consider, or maybe things that you did before, but still maybe they weren't as well thought out, and it wasn't until you were in the moment that you were like, okay, that didn't go as planned, and so that's what good teaching is just kind of doing a reflection and seeing, where the holes or the gaps are, and then just kind of filling those in. So we're glad that this was definitely a helpful piece, and hopefully it will be a helpful tool for you all as we go into the school year. But we've got weeks you got plenty of time to think about that, so don't want you to have to be forced to think about 2022-23 school year so soon when you just got out. So All right. Let's see here. So, for the sake of time, we'll kind of not breeze through, but a lot of this, we're going to, of course, share the presentation with you. So again, just I wanted to make sure that we put out there that it is super important to teach the routines, and it's going to take time. You may not see positive results, and you may see that you need to go back to the drawing board, or that students aren't very responsive the first or second time out the gate, and it's going to take some time. You are going to absolutely need to model them for most students. And that reinforcing them and revisiting the expectations at the beginning of the day before certain activities, be it transition to or from technology, from circle time, and going over group expectations. It's not going to be, well, you know what, I've told them about 3 or 4 times and they still don't get it. I just don't think they'll get it. We don't want to write our students off, but that some of those things will definitely come with time, and so you need to make sure that you are patient and, just be ready to keep going with it. I mean, and then when we even come back second semester or after long breaks, we find that we have to revisit routines again, because just in the couple weeks that we've been off, students seem to forget sometimes the routines that we've established, and they've even seemed to grasp, and it's almost like we're starting at square one again, even after longer breaks. So it's super important. Jamie, did you have anything you wanted to add before I moved on to the next?
I think I was still thinking about Alyssa's comment on the last one, but it kind of goes with this one too. Like, I do think it waxes and wanes. Like, you start the year off, you're pretty tight. You have, you hit it hard, you teach it, the students do that. And as the students drift away from holding students, like from doing the procedures, routines as we expect, we also drift away from holding them to our expectations and holding them accountable. So a lot of that is on us to be consistent. But also we know that, say, the week before Christmas break, we generally get a little looser, but really we should tighten up because they need more support on behavior and meeting our expectations. Like, we end up frustrated and we're just like, why don't we just go ahead and end school? It's like, we all say that, right? That last week. And really, we have gotten relaxed as well. And when the behavior is showing us that they are not able to meet the needs of the environment, then that's when we provide more structure, not just throw our hands up. But I realize everyone's tired at that point. But that's why we've already established these, and we can fall back on our routines and procedures. I think that's it.
All right.
I put this in last minute just because I'm always on this campaign. I'm not going to read it to you, but it might seem to come out of nowhere, but I was thinking about supporting your routines and expectations visually. How can we do that for students? And we have some slides here in a little bit that kind of give different examples of that. But I wanted to give all of my reasons and some from other people. And the best way I can make this relatable is, have you guys ever made a cake and you get the cake box and you look at it and it says like 3 eggs, a 4th cup of oil, and half a cup of water. And you're like, oh, got that. You pitch that, you go to get the eggs, and you come back and you're like, how many was it? Oh, shoot, let me dig that box out of the trash. And okay, I got it. And then you go get the oil. How much was that? And then you have to dig it out of the trash again. Oh, it's a 1/4 cup. So we need visuals too. It's permanent. It's there. Then we don't have to rely on, the students don't have to rely on us to answer the questions. We can just refer back to the visual that shows the routine or the steps in the procedures or all of our expectations. So now we thought that we would give you a few minutes to think about maybe a procedure or expectation that you saw on the self-assessment and go through some of these steps. So you would choose a procedure and then think, how can I clearly define this? Are there any words that might be debatable or interpreted a different way? Where can I post it so that it can be a cue to the students? How can I teach it? And then how am I going to cue myself to hold the students accountable or to remember to use this visual cue or this procedure? And then we have our 4 questions here. So our team we call these the Gorski questions from Paul Gorski, but really to think about those equity pieces. So within any procedure or routine or expectation, we want to say, who is this norm to? Who is it leaving out? Who is this impacting in a negative way? And is this procedure going to reduce inequity in the classroom? And get everyone the same access and opportunities, or is it going to expand inequity? And one example I can give of that, if you have like that example of the word respect, or we can say voice volume. If we're like, oh, you're allowed to talk to a friend, but indoor voice, well, I think we all know what that means, but we can't assume that students do. And so if we have students that talk louder, but we are more normed to a quiet and we think that's an indoor voice, then that procedure asking them to use an indoor voice where they're failing or they have a different definition would be expanding inequity. So we have to do some clarification around that. So I know you probably won't be able to get through all that in 5 minutes, but I think I would like for you to get started and just pick one. That way you have a chance to think through it in this way. So you could turn your cameras off. It's 9:21. So I say, or 22. Let's come back together at 9:27. Okay, so it is 9:27. So when you're ready, close out what you're working on and rejoin the group. And we won't take a lot of time, but did anyone get started and get past step 1 that they would like to share about? No. Okay, I got it. It's early, and maybe you were stuck saying, I don't even know where to start. So we give you that grace. We completely understand. So we'll move on, but hopefully, thinking through creating those and using these steps would be a good way to help launch your work for next year to be prepared.
Jamie, I can share one real quick if it's helpful, just
Oh,
from my
yeah, sure.
experience having been a principal. So when I was a principal, it was in a charter network, and we had very rigid expectations for students. And so I think about some of the things that we had to do. And one of the things we did is when our kids were not working or not busy, they had to sit with their hands folded on their desk like this. Now, I say all of this because please know I walked into a network culture that I had to adopt. So some of these are not things that I necessarily agree with, but sitting with our hands on our desk like this, if we're not doing work, if we're waiting, if we're listening to listening to directions, and we call that SLANT, which was for an acronym for silently listen and I forget what it was, but STAR in the elementary. So who was this normed to? This was normed to kids who could sit still, kids who had like really long attention spans, who could do it, who had that kind of self-control, kids whose cultures required that direct eye contact of tracking the speaker, of being polite, not speaking until you're spoken to. And so then, like, conversely, it's leaving out anybody who can't fit within that norm. Um, it really made kids who couldn't do that feel like they didn't belong or something was wrong with them. And so, in my mind, that really increased inequity, because kids could show me that they were listening in different ways. And I needed to figure out how to adjust to that. So that's one quick one. I think Angela said she has one as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Todd. Yeah, that's a good example. I think that what sometimes becomes difficult about those questions for me is, yes, it did leave out those students. And then I think at what times, and not necessarily with that example, but I don't want to lower my expectations. And so I always have to forcefully train myself to go back the other way and say, no, I don't lower my expectations. I have to think differently about my expectations and how can I support and build up. But the first question is always the appropriateness of the expectation. And it sounds like that procedure, whereas I get where they were going, doesn't necessarily feel appropriate. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Okay, Angela.
Sorry. Mine comes from the virtual environment because that is where I have the most experience for the last few years. And the biggest thing that we struggle with is getting kids on their microphones. And you would think, in the class they're chatty, they talk, but then it's like they freeze up when they get in a virtual and they're like, I'm not going to turn my mic on. And then you have the challenges of the background, what's going on in their background that they may or may not want you to hear. So I looked at this for next year, how we can improve that. And I always go back to visual because I'm a visual learner. And I think a lot of kids maybe in the same boat, where you can talk for a half hour and they're not going to hear anything you say, but if you give them a visual, they've got it immediately. So I'm pretty heavy on PowerPoints. So I think when doing expectations in the virtual environment, like you have the PowerPoint on the screen, I think it's easy to forget when you're teaching that, oh, they don't need that. They don't need the visual, you know, they don't need the extra scaffolding. So I was just kind of looking at scaffolding that you could use to help encourage the protocols for, speaking on the mic. Do you raise your hand first? Do you not raise your hand? Do you just jump on? Just kind of defining it. And I really liked how you said the lens that you look through, it removes anxiety if they know. And that really struck a chord with me.
Well, I'm glad that you found that helpful. And yeah, I think especially in the virtual world and with older students, kind of like what Alyssa was saying, you assume like we've been doing this for 10 years. You know the expectations, but it doesn't hurt ever to clarify them at each transition. Really is what they recommend. Like every time you change activities, here are the new expectations for this activity. And even within a block, so we think I have a different expectation for direct instruction than I do for independent work time or small group time. During direct instruction, no, you may not go to the bathroom or get up to get a pencil. You can get up to get a tissue. That's about it. And you don't really need to raise your hand and talk because I'm doing the instruction. But during group time, yeah, you can move around then if you need to for these specific reasons. You can use a level 1 voice if I've explicitly taught what that is, right? So if I'm always clarifying with each turn in the instructional cycle or our school day, then it's clear for everyone and it does reduce that anxiety. Thank you so much.
Uh-oh.
I know. It's like,
For some reason, let's see. Here we go.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, a time of day that you dread. So I was just thinking about an experience I had one year where it was like, oh, math. And it's just like, because it was so hard. The students were not enjoying it. I felt like they just weren't following any of the expectations. And it was just like, I just hated when that time of day came day after day. And eventually I was like, I can't live like this anymore. What am I going to do? Like, this is ridiculous. If I'm this unhappy, surely they are also unhappy and we're not going anywhere. And that cued me to say, as my routines and expectations need some work. Like, I'm not providing enough support. And maybe that was in teaching, but a lot of it often is just remembering and holding the students accountable to things that we agreed to, because it takes a lot of effort and energy and time away from academics at first. So thinking through some of these things might help point you in a direction of what you can do to alleviate those times of the day that you are dreading. I think that last one's important. Do we expect them to be independent when they are just not ready for that yet? They need some support. They're clearly telling us that. So I won't say any more about that. I think it's relatable. We've all had those moments in our school day, school year. So that can kind of give you some questions to fall back on. And I'm trying to be mindful of our time. So I'm just not chatting as much.
Okay. Let me know if you want me to.
Yeah, no, I think so. We're thinking broadly about how we can add in some support. And then I'm thinking more about specific students, because we have a lot of complexity going on that we don't think about in creating these, making sure they're equitable. How do we communicate them? How do we refer back to them and enforce and hold students accountable? And then we know that we have students in our classes that speak different languages or that have specific skill deficits. And if what do we say? If we can predict it, we can plan for it. And so if we know that those students exist in our classrooms, then we can prepare for that when we're thinking through supporting our expectations and procedures.
All right. And so here we are talking about how you are supporting your students and your own executive functioning. So just to, not to, I don't want to assume that anyone does or does not know what it means. So it's your mental skills that include like your working memory, your flexible thinking, and your self-control. And, we use these skills every day to manage everyday life. And so when we think about things that we can do to help support students in our own executive function, here are some suggestions here. So we think about using visual supports and written instructions, lots of repetition. And we've said this quite a bit throughout the presentation today, breaking things into smaller steps, calling attention to important information and highlighting, enlarging things, color coding to aid memory, and being explicit with every new expectation. So again, they're not going to hit it the first, second, or maybe even the third time that you show them something. It's going to take a while, but model, 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 physically model. Some students are going to need that. Some may even need you to come up and guide them physically, put your hands on them and help them through, so think about any opportunities to bring all students, along with you, because you're going to have students that you can just tell them and they've got it. You've got students where they're going to need visual aids, and you're going to have students where you're going to need to physically support them. So any opportunities to make things equitable, and to support executive functioning, these are lots of good examples of how to do so.
So we are going to share this presentation with you. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Some of these are broad examples of how you can support, and then some of these get to more specific. So if I look at using visual supports to track what needs to be done, some students will be fine with just like this list. Here are all the things we're doing today. And you can see the bottom one there that says reminders at the screen on a phone. That's just a different higher tech version of that we as adults use, but students could use. But then we get more specific for students who might need a little bit more support. First, next, then. We added some steps. And then we get even more specific for students who aren't able to meet the expectation with that. So then we are going to have more steps within activities, and that could look different ways. That clearly is for a younger student or a student who has more academic challenges, but it can be a Post-it note with 5 steps on it to complete math. So it doesn't have to look as juvenile, as some kids may say, or immature as a picture schedule does, but I just wanted to highlight how we can do broad. Okay, that's not working. We add in some more support, and then we even need to go further and break it down in more steps and provide more visual support. But the rest of those, Eric, if you just kind of want to spend 5 seconds on each screen, give some examples of how you can increase your support to support executive function, and that will generally be what you need to do. Alyssa did refer to CHAMPS, and I know that Sanders does this. I did this in my classroom, and it's a program that really uses that acronym of CHAMP, and then S is success. And every time you have a transition, you reset your board. So it's kind of what I was referring to. Okay, it's direct instruction. So we're not going to have any talking. You need to raise your hand if you need something. Your activity, you're listening right now, and there is no movement. Participation would look like you're either taking notes or nodding your head or sitting quietly. So every time we would have a transition in the classroom, we reviewed what those expectations were. I just did not assume that my students knew what I expected out of them. So if you want more information on this, I have the books, I have lots of resources. Alyssa has things that she uses in her classroom because she does embed those in a PowerPoint, like Angela talked about. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I'd be happy to share it. It really was a game changer. Okay, sorry, Eric. I keep saying I'm not talking.
It's okay. Okay.
Here, I won't spend time on that, but that's just increasing the independence. I mentioned earlier, we said sometimes we expect for them to be fluent, and they're not with what we expect. So here are some ways to think through that a little bit. Yes, the PowerPoints, it cues you to do it as well when it comes up in the PowerPoint. Okay, Erica, I think that's good.
Mm-hmm.
And do you want to take it from there, Erica? I know we've kind of adjusted since we're almost out of time, and I'm wondering if we need to adjust again. But
yeah. So, because we know that we're in our last few minutes, a big thing that I think that we're going to naturally, just even given the conversation that we've had so far in this meeting, think about for this upcoming school year are transitions. And I'm pretty sure that we can all think of those points in the day where, especially at the beginning of the year, and even when we're further into the year, and you're like, kids should have this down by now, this routine down by now. They just don't. Why are they so hard? So when you think about what was your worst transition last year, you are going to want to think back to that specific time. It could be, like I said, some things we mentioned earlier, shifting from tech to back to everyone is here watching the teacher teach at the board. It could be going from group time to now you're working independently or vice versa. It could be, okay, we are coming back from specials and we know all kinds of chaos happens when you say, hey, pull out this assignment, when people have to run to their cubbies, dig through their desks, or, whatever the situation may be. There are just certain times of day where you could have it all planned out and it still just goes awry. So we are going to, do you think that we should kind of
yeah, we have all these flags on transition, and we thought, oh well, we will let them look at that and we'll just play the short little video, but I think we even ran out of time for that. So do you want to scroll through a couple of these just so that they know?
Sure.
So we talked about what's the recipe for success, some things to think about for transitions, and we'll share that out with you. And then the next couple of slides, I believe, are about supporting transitions. So some things to think about if the whole class seems to be struggling. And then I think the next slide really highlights, nope, let's do the next one. Sorry. Yes, that one. Individual support, some things to think about if it's just a student or two or at a very specific time that someone is struggling with transitions. That last one with the visual is a version of behavior mapping, and what that really is helping the student see, if I do this, what is the possible outcome? If I do this, what's the possible outcome? And so I just wanted to give an example of that because I did not think that might be common knowledge for everyone. But I think for the sake of time, you guys can go through that yourselves, and we'll follow up. Or did you go ahead and share that, Erica?
I shared the video because even
Okay.
if you look at the presentation, I don't know if it was clear with the coloring that there would be a link in there for a video about transition. So I dropped that in the chat. That's that YouTube video link, just so that you can pop it open. I think it's roughly about 3 minutes or so. But I wanted to make sure that you saw that. So.
Okay, well, I'm sorry that we got cut short, but it's your summer. I definitely want to be respectful of your time. I'm so glad that you guys joined us. Like Mr. Hawk said, we recorded this video, so will we be sharing that out? I'm not sure where it will be housed.
Yeah, I've got it. Hopefully, since I changed some settings, hopefully it'll be emailed to me, and then I'll put it on our YouTube channel and then send everyone a link.
Okay. And Eric and I will follow up within the next day or so, sending out some resources. We'll share